I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Andrea Mercado, the Executive Director of Florida Rising, an independent organization working to increase the voting and political power of Florida's Black and Brown communities. Andrea joins me to discuss politics in Florida, of course, and we do a brief postmortem of the state for the 2020 election cycle, including how Democrats came up short and what they need to do to win seats during the upcoming midterms and during the 2024 election cycle. So here is my conversation with Andrea Mercado. Andrea Mercado, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's talk about 2020 in Florida. At some point during the 2020 election cycle, Florida was expected to be in play for Democrats. And I remember thinking that that would be great. However, I'm not so certain. I know you'd written an op-ed saying that we could actually win Florida. And I don't know if we have all of the data out of Florida yet, but what exactly happened there, specifically, around the Latino vote, which people thought would bring that home for Biden?
Well, I think what we've seen is in Florida, time and time again, elections come down to 0.5%, less than 1% of the electorate. We're one of the largest states in the country, 23 million people. And in 2018, Andrew Gillum was poised to be the first Black governor in the South, and the margin of victory was less than 30,000 votes. Senator Bill Nelson lost his race with 12,000 votes. So it's always painfully close in Florida. And so we were preparing for an epic battle in 2020. But I think because of the size of the state, oftentimes it means that Democratic donors get nervous. It decide to invest resources in other states that doesn't have such a large population. Florida is notoriously complex, 14 media markets, 67 counties. I have family from Miami to Jacksonville, and those are very different places culturally, demographically. And I think what we saw in 2020 is the Democrats kind of be gun shy around, couldn't really make a decision whether or not they were going to invest and really fight to win in Florida. And as a result, you saw the Biden campaign, not really putting resources into the state until it was unfortunately too late. The Trump campaign, the Republican Party was always clear. If they didn't win Florida, they had no path to the White House. And so Trump was outspending Biden 2-1 on Spanish language radio in July, and unfortunately that didn't flip until October, when we saw Biden outspending Trump 3-1 in Spanish language radio. And it was too late. By then many people had already cast their votes. They voted by mail, they voted early. And the Trump administration, they never stopped campaigning in Florida. After their 2016 victory, they set up permanent infrastructure. They were down here in South Florida all the time. I think South Florida is known to be kind of the heart of Hispanic conservatism. And I think it really is unlike any other part of the country, where if you listen to the radio in Spanish in South Florida, it's right-wing ideology. It's very conservative, it's racist, it's misogynist. And, I think on the progressive side, I think time and time again, we keep seeing resources just come in a few months before an election. And then they build these sandcastles that wash away the week after an election. And that's really why, it's why New Florida Majority was founded. It's why Florida Rising was founded. Florida Rising is actually the union of New Florida Majority and Organized Florida, two organizations that believe in year-round, long-term organizing to fight for the futures of our communities and the future of our state. And in January 2021, we actually decided to create one statewide organization, Florida Rising, that's building independent political power that really centers Black and Brown communities in the state.
Yeah, Florida's a really tricky state, right? And a lot of people like to make the comparison to Georgia, because I think there's an organization, I know there's an organization called New Georgia Majority, or is it Georgia Rising?
New Georgia Project.
New Georgia Project, of course. How could I not remember that? That's one of my favorite orgs. But they're similar in some ways, and they're not similar in a lot of other ways, right? It's tricky because people, for one reason, is that people were under the impression, or at least I was under the impression, that you had to win Florida to win the election, to win the entire election, right? And so, when I saw the spending towards the end of the election on the Democratic side, I was a little worried. I was like, well, we're this close. Could we, put a little more dollars into Florida? But that wasn't the case. Like Trump won Florida and he didn't win the election. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I'm not a campaign manager. I'm not really sure how these decisions were made, but it's a hard thing, I would imagine, to decide like, okay, where do we put our resources to make sure that they have, the maximum output, the maximum return on investment, without leaving the constituents behind, those Latino voters in Florida who need to hear your message. Mm-hmm. How do you balance those two? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it seems like the Biden campaign strategically decided that they were going to carve a different path, that they were going to go through Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And then we picked up these incredible victories in Arizona and Georgia. But, as a result of some of those strategic choices, it meant that, Florida didn't get the level of investment and attention that would be required for it to, truly be a battleground and for us to fight to win. And I think while we all celebrate that there's been a really critical change in Washington, D.C., it really came with some hard losses here in Florida. We lost some of our champions. We lost Debbie Murkisel Powell. We lost Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez. So, we had some painful losses as a result. And I think it does really cause a lot of soul searching for the Democratic Party in Florida. What does it mean when minimum wage, a $15 minimum wage, passed with 60% of voters in Florida? Over 60% of Floridians said, yes, we believe that Floridians deserve a $15 minimum wage, but then voted for Republicans, went on and voted for elected officials that are fundamentally opposed to raising the minimum wage. So I think there's a lot of questions within the Democratic Party around why is there such a disconnect between progressive policies and people actually voting for Democrats. And, I think it's one of the things that's really hard here in Florida is you see Democrats consistently trying to run to the middle. They think that they have to be the most moderate in order to win. Many people who ran, who distanced themselves from a $15 minimum wage, which is kind of mind-boggling, considering how popular it is and how popular progressive issues are. And I do think that that's why I pointed to Andrew Gillum's gubernatorial run, because he really proved that in a state like Florida, you could be a bold progressive and forge the kind of coalition that can get across the finish line, because he came closer than any other Democratic challenger for that seat in more than a decade. So I think that there's some real important lessons to be learned, and definitely, the Republican Party, they used a lot of fear mongering around socialism, and a lot of Latinos had lost their jobs in the service industry, and the Republican Party pledging to reopen. And when people were really hurting, it wasn't just here in South Florida that we saw voters, Biden underperforming Clinton. We actually saw more Latinos voting for Trump in places like the Bronx and in places like Los Angeles. And even if Latinos had gone for Biden in Miami-Dade, Trump still would have taken Florida. So I think that for those of us that are committed to turning Florida blue, to breaking the right-wing stranglehold in Tallahassee, to stopping attacks on voting rights and all of the other things that the Republican Party does when they're in power, we know that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And that work for 2022 begins now. We can't wait till the summer or fall of 2022 to defeat Marco Rubio or to defeat Governor DeSantis. We have to have those conversations early and often. We have to be talking to people now about what's at stake and why it matters.
Yeah, and I don't envy you. That's a really hard job. I mean, just, going back to what you just said about, the progressive messaging and how some voters were kind of moving to the center, but then they also supported these progressive policies. Like, that is the complicated part about Florida. Because if I remember correctly, during the primary, Biden won Florida I think by a lot, like by 60, he was like 62 or 65% or something like that. And he was not considered, I laugh when I say this because he wasn't considered the progressive candidate, right? The voters of Florida support, this progressive policy, just using, the $15 minimum wage as an example. They support policies like that. Yet then again, Florida, I think Trump outperformed himself in 2020. He did better than he did in 2016. So I don't really know how you untangle that whole, that's not a question, that's just a statement.
No, and it is a complex place. And I think that's why the depth of Trump's relationships, the fact that he was here in South Florida so often. I mean, he made Florida his home. He officially changed his residence, and so did his campaign manager. They really invested a lot of not just resources, but their time into building support that they need and really motivated their base. And we didn't really see that on the progressive side. And I think, there's a real opportunity in 2022 where we have a U.S. Senate race. We're seeing some people stepping up to challenge Marco Rubio. And Governor DeSantis is also one of the worst performing governors in the nation when it comes to COVID. We have the worst unemployment system in the country. It's an unemployment system that was designed to fail. The disparities between the number of white Floridians who have gotten the vaccine and the number of Black and Latino seniors that have gotten the vaccine is very alarming. And DeSantis is out here giving the vaccine to his rich donors. So, I think it'll be really interesting to see how that battle for 2022 shapes up, because Trump won't be on the ballot, and DeSantis and Rubio won't be able to motivate the Trump base. And so I think that there'll be some really unique opportunities for us to finally break the right wing trifecta in Tallahassee. And I think that when you look at DeSantis's popularity ratings, I think he might see some troubling writing on the wall, but at the same time, he's the darling of the Republican Party and is setting himself up for a presidential run. So I think it's never a dull moment here in Florida politics.
Yeah, well, I'm going to parse that a little bit because, I think a lot of people are saying, well, Trump isn't on the ballot, right? But Trumpism, I think, is forever on the ballot. Right? Like, because our politics weren't like this, 4 years ago. Well, they were 4 years ago, but 8 years ago, 12 years ago. So I think that for a while now, I think Democrats have to think of these races as, especially where Trump won in 2020, saying, well, Trump isn't on the ballot, but Trumpism definitely is. Like, he's made a lasting impression, I think, just, this is just my opinion, in places like Florida. Because when you think about it, Bush v. Gore, that election that hinged on Florida, I think Gore lost that state by 0.0009% or something. Like it was really, really razor thin. And over time, it's just become redder. So I don't know. I think we do to some extent have to battle Trumpism for a while, right? But I guess my next question is, what messaging does work for Floridians?
Well, I think people need to know that what the Democratic Party stands for. And that's why it's of critical importance that we do see some real policy change that affects people's lives. That's why, we're really disappointed to see $15 minimum wage not making it into the relief package. But, the stimulus checks and the support for working families is going to be critical, because at the end of the day, I think what we hear time and time again on the doors and in the neighborhoods when we're organizing is what's going to be different, like what's really going to change. It's really on the Democratic Party that does have power in Washington, D.C. to illustrate that, because we don't here in Florida, where Tallahassee and our state politics is controlled by the right, unfortunately, we're not able to show that distinction and what the Democratic Party really stands for. And so I think we really do need Democrats to stand up and go to bat for working families and, make a name for themselves, especially at a time like this where we're in such deep crisis, where so many people are out of work. So many people have been impacted by, their health and job loss. This is a time for bold policy solutions. And the question is the Democratic Party going to stand in the gap and really show some strong leadership here?
So I'm curious about how, COVID's going there and the COVID rate, because, DeSantis has made some poor decisions in that regard. Do you think messaging around COVID will move some of those voters, some of those Trump voters over to the Democratic side in 2024?
Yeah, I absolutely think that showing these vaccine disparities is important because it highlights some of the biggest problems in our society. Really understanding that, Black and brown people are 40% of the state, but only 13% of those vaccinated. When we, expose that DeSantis is doing giving special vaccine access to wealthy people in gated communities that vote for him, and then receiving checks the week after, I think that kind of corruption and that kind of favoritism really does anger people. So I think it'll be really important for us to do that education and make sure people know. Also, with our unemployment system, we have some of the lowest unemployment checks in the country, and it takes the longest for you to actually get your we had people waiting for months and months to try to get their unemployment check because our system was designed to fail. And so, I do think that those, at the end of the day, Governor DeSantis is responsible. And Governor Scott before him, and really, demanding some accountability there, and making sure people understand that that's not the way it is in other parts of the country. We have some of the, like the worst unemployment debacle in the nation, and people losing their cars and losing their homes and not being able to put food on the table as a result is a real disgrace.
So how do you bring relief to Floridians who vote Democratic or who want those progressive policies, like the $15 minimum wage, for instance, and while the work is happening on the ground to flip the state blue?
Yeah, no, ballot initiatives, I think for us have been a real pathway to progressive change. In 2018, we were able to pass Amendment 4, making sure that people with felony convictions are able to vote. In 2020, we passed a $15 minimum wage. In 2022, we're looking at things like Medicaid expansion and automatic voter registration. And time again, while the vast majority of Floridians say, yes, we want that policy, Republicans in Tallahassee try to undermine it, making people with felony convictions pay a poll tax and pay fines and fees before they can vote. Or now they're trying to undermine minimum wage, saying, if you're under 21 or if you have a disability or you have a felony conviction, you actually should be paid a second-class wage. You should be paid a training wage and not have access to the minimum wage increase that Floridians voted for. So, we're out here fighting for what we believe in, and we're clear we need to shift political power to unlock victories on all the issues we care about. And I think it's important to note that even the fact that Republicans are hanging on by their fingernails or are just barely getting these victories after massive levels of investment, I think really says something to the appetite in Florida for change. And I think while 2020 didn't have the kind of results that we wanted here in Florida, and there are a lot of factors and reasons for that, I think that there's so many organizations and labor unions and institutions coming together to figure out what's it going to take. We saw that change in Georgia. We know that it's possible, and I think we all feel like it's right around the corner, and we're just laying the foundation and doing the work that's necessary for us to be able to get there.
So what's the biggest change in your strategy going into the midterms in 2024, given what you've learned about 2020?
I think it's really doubling down on organizing and doubling down on engaging Black voters, engaging Latino voters, engaging young voters early and often. So, I think 2020 was a year unlike any other with COVID and a global pandemic bearing down that really limited our ability to be out there responsibly. And, the Republican Party didn't care about, wouldn't shut down their canvases and wouldn't, take COVID seriously and believed it was a hoax. But I think that those are the ingredients, that we need in 2022 and beyond, is just that commitment to really talking to our folks, and whether it's online or on the doors or by phone, and really combating the disinformation and the lies that the Republican Party is spewing. And I think we do need candidates that are capable of energizing and exciting our base, because, the New Majority Coalition is out there. Like, if we're able to unite communities of color and progressive white people and young people, we're going to be able to take it. And, there's still millions of people out there who are eligible to vote that aren't registered or aren't voting. And that's our work, is to go get them and make sure that we expand democracy and defend it.
Well, Andrea Mercado, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I will be watching Florida very closely, because you're right. We need to start right now for 2022, for the midterms, and for 2024. We can't wait. But thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you for having me.